Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. What do you call a woman who marries three men at once, drains their bank accounts, and poisons one of them on his birthday? To the outside world, Dina Thompson was polite, dependable, even charming. But when Julian Webb's body was exhumed 7 years after his death, what the coroner found shocked even veteran detectives. This isn't a whodunit. It's a story of how long a killer can hide in plain sight, if she's quiet, calculated, and wears the mask of a loving wife. June 13th, 1994, Hayling Island, Hampshire, UK. A coastal town with no violent crime that year. No break-ins, no missing persons, no calls to 911 from Julian Webb's address. Until the next morning. At 7:48 a.m., Dina Thompson walked into her local GP surgery and reported that her husband had collapsed during the night. She said he had been drinking. He'd taken sleeping pills. By the time she realized something was wrong, he wasn't breathing. When the paramedics arrived, Julian was lying on the living room floor. No pulse, body cool. Time of death, estimated sometime around 1 to 2 a.m. No signs of trauma, no blood, no overturned furniture. The place was quiet, too quiet. The initial assessment listed it as sudden adult death syndrome. There was no immediate concern. Julian was 31 years old, healthy. But Dina, already referred to by neighbors as organized and always in control, told responders he had been in a dark place lately. She mentioned his stress, his drinking, his moods. There were no medical records supporting any of that. Still, it was enough to satisfy the coroner, at least in 1994. Julian's cause of death was marked unascertained, no autopsy. He was buried days later at St. Mary's Cemetery, just outside town. Closed casket, no toxicology. Dina requested cremation, but Julian's mother pushed back. She wanted her son buried, not burned. And without knowing it, that decision would preserve the one piece of evidence no one realized they'd need, because the poison hadn't just passed through his body, it had stayed. In the months that followed, life around Dina looked quiet, predictable. She kept to herself, changed addresses twice, closed Julian's accounts, collected life insurance, and made no effort to stay connected with his family. Some might call that grief, but others, years later, would call it a checklist. Dina told friends Julian had struggled emotionally in the weeks leading up to his death, that he had been losing weight, that his job had been stressing him out. But none of that lined up with the letters Julian had been writing in his final month, letters his family kept, letters that spoke of wanting a fresh start, of rethinking his marriage, letters Dina never mentioned. There was no crime scene, no recorded call to police. No photos of the room where Julian died, but first responders noted two things in the medical log. Dina appeared controlled, unemotional. She had already removed the dishes from the night before. Julian's birthday meal, his favorite homemade curry, was gone by the time responders arrived. Only the smell lingered. No food samples, no analysis. The GP, later asked in inquiry, said he had no reason to believe anything sinister had occurred. After all, Dina seemed calm. She provided a narrative. She didn't run. She followed protocol. And that's the problem with killers who don't panic. They rarely get caught until they make the next move. It would take 6 more years for anything to unravel. In that time, Dina would remarry, open new accounts, live quietly. But in 2000, her next husband, Richard Thompson, would end up in the emergency room. His injuries didn't match her explanation. Police were called. A new investigation opened. And that's when someone noticed the name Julian Webb buried in a forgotten file. The cold case unit in West Sussex reopened the death inquiry, not because of something new at the scene, but because the same woman had just appeared in a second incident involving unexplained injuries, financial fraud, and violence. And the body they never checked in 1994, it was still 6 feet underground, perfectly preserved. There's a reason some investigators don't trust clean timelines. The data aligns too neatly, the paperwork is too perfect. And in cases like this one, that's often the problem. When Julian Webb died in 1994, no criminal charges were filed. No inquiry was opened. There was no autopsy, no toxicology. On the surface, it was a tragic but routine fatality. But when the name Dina Thompson resurfaced 6 years later in connection with a domestic violence complaint, a cold case team in Sussex began looking at her history, and something didn't add up. They started with marriage records. What they found was a legal anomaly, one that would eventually form the foundation of a reopened investigation. According to the registry office in Eastbourne, Dina had married Lee Wyatt in 1984. That marriage was still legally valid at the time she walked down the aisle with Julian in 1991. No divorce had been filed, no legal separation on record, nothing to suggest she was free to remarry. Yet Julian's marriage certificate, held in the local archives, was signed and certified, a second legal wedding, to a woman who was already someone else's wife. Then came the third marriage, Richard Thompson, 1998. Also certified, no background flags, no red tape. 3 husbands, one legally recognized at a time, and none of them knew about the others. By the year 2000, all 3 names were finally connected because the third husband, Richard, had survived an attack that brought Dina under police scrutiny. That's when a detective flagged the earlier non-suspicious death of Julian Webb. The dates now looked less like coincidence, more like structure. Investigators pulled employment records, financial files, phone logs. There was no digital trail in 1994, no text messages or social media, but there were patterns. Utility bills opened under different names, overlapping addresses tied to different Mrs. Thompsons. Insurance policies filed within months of each marriage. One detail stood out. Julian's life insurance, £36,000 in benefits, was updated just 8 weeks before his death. The beneficiary changed from his mother to his wife. The handwriting on the form was consistent with Dina's, though she claimed Julian had filled it out at the kitchen table. No witness signature was provided. It passed through because the office processing the paperwork didn't require a second review for small policies. But here's the detail that mattered most. The bank account linked to that insurance payout was opened 48 hours before Julian's death. Investigators traced it to a branch in Portsmouth. The signature on the account matched Dina's. Julian had no history with that bank. He never used it, never authorized it. One detective on the task force wrote in his report, "This isn't a story about love, it's a story about paperwork." And every document signed by Julian Webb during his final month of life either benefited Dina Thompson or erased someone else. No friends or family could recall Julian ever talking about another bank or about life insurance at all. A review of his employment file confirmed he'd never opted into supplemental coverage before that year. He was healthy, he had no children, and he had made no mention of terminal illness. There was no reason for a new policy, except one. By October 2000, Dina's past was no longer scattered across unrelated files. It was mapped: 3 marriages, 2 active at once, 1 unexplained death, and another near-fatal assault. Police interviewed neighbors from Julian's old flat. One woman recalled something odd. Julian had seemed distant during his last weeks. Not upset, not emotional, just distracted. He didn't show up to darts night. He forgot to lock his garage. He'd asked the landlord for the lease copy, just in case. Another neighbor, Mrs. Findley, said Julian once told her, "I think she's up to something," referring to Dina, but never explained what he meant. That conversation happened 5 days before his birthday, 5 days before the curry dinner, 5 days before his death. Detectives flagged that marriage records are often background noise in an investigation. Not this time. In this case, they were the case. When West Sussex police reviewed Dina's marriage to Richard Thompson in 1998, they realized she had again used the same name, same birth date, but slightly altered addresses. None of the systems caught it. She moved frequently, always within a short radius, always just far enough to be outside one jurisdiction's radar. This wasn't random. It wasn't sloppy. It was operational. In 2001, police submitted a formal request to reclassify Julian Webb's death as suspicious. That reclassification was based entirely on documentation. No blood, no wounds, no DNA. Just inconsistencies in legal forms, overlapping dates, and missing witness information. A month later, they obtained court authorization to exhume Julian Webb's body. It had been buried, not cremated, thanks to a decision by Julian's mother who had a feeling something wasn't right. That gut instinct preserved the one piece of evidence that would later confirm what no one could prove at the time: Julian had not died of natural causes. It didn't take a murder scene to open this case. It took someone surviving one. In August of 2000, 6 years after Julian Webb was buried in a quiet plot on Hayling Island, the Sussex Police Department received a call from a man who claimed he had been attacked in his home by his wife. His name was Richard Thompson, and what he told officers that night would mark the first serious break in a case no one had realized was still open. At the time, Richard wasn't on any police radar, no history of violence, no prior complaints. But when he arrived at the hospital, he was bleeding from a head wound, bruised across the neck, and according to the triage report, shaken but coherent. He told medical staff he'd been struck multiple times by a woman he had married just 2 years earlier. Her name? Dina Thompson. She claimed it was a sex game, that he had consented, that the bruises were staged, that he'd been playing along, but emergency room staff flagged inconsistencies. The laceration on the back of Richard's skull had been caused by a blunt object, not a fall, not accidental. And when officers searched the home, they found a baseball bat under the bed, wiped clean but with a small trace of blood still visible beneath the grip tape. Richard made a formal statement. He described how Dina had blindfolded him, tied his wrists, and told him it was part of a surprise. When he resisted, she struck him. He managed to get loose. He locked himself in the bathroom. He waited until she left the house and then drove himself to the nearest hospital. At first, detectives in the Domestic Crimes Unit handled the case like any other assault. But when the case manager typed Dina's name into the national database, something unexpected appeared. Her previous marriages, and one familiar death certificate, Julian Webb, died, June 1994. Cause of death, unascertained. Age, 31. Spouse listed, Dina Thompson. What started as a domestic violence complaint became the reason police reopened a cold case. A special crimes unit was assembled to cross-reference all 3 of Dina's known marriages. The lead investigator reviewed Julian's file and requested access to archived coroner's notes, paramedic logs, and the original death certificate. There were no photographs, no autopsy, just a handwritten medical note stating that the wife had claimed he drank heavily that night and took a few pills to calm down. In 1994, that had been enough. In 2000, it wasn't. Richard Thompson's case changed everything. Detectives interviewed Richard again in a controlled environment. He described Dina as controlling, obsessive with money, and secretive about her past. She had no photos of prior relationships. She avoided phone calls from numbers he didn't recognize, and she handled all bills herself, often refusing to let him even check balances. He recalled an argument 2 weeks before the attack where he confronted her about £12,000 missing from their joint account. She claimed it had been invested. When he asked for documentation, she shut the conversation down. After the incident, Richard hired a solicitor to review his financial history. Bank records showed that within the last 18 months, Dina had transferred over £20,000 to an offshore account in Jersey, an account not registered under her legal name but under the alias Denise Wyatt. That alias matched the surname from Dina's first marriage to Lee Wyatt, which had never been legally dissolved. That detail led officers to cross-reference marriage certificates with bank records, overlapping names, altered signatures, modified addresses, and it all pointed to the same strategy: marry, isolate, gain access to funds, and move on. In October 2000, the task force submitted a formal request to reclassify Julian Webb's death as a suspicious fatality. 2 months later, the Crown Prosecution Service approved a full reinvestigation. On the strength of Richard Thompson's sworn statement, forensic officers reopened the case file, not only on the alleged attack, but on the death that had gone unnoticed for 6 years. The next step was to secure a court order to exhume Julian's body. It was still intact, buried at St. Mary's. His mother, still living in Sussex, gave full consent. She had never believed her son's death was natural, but no one listened, she said in a statement. She wanted him cremated. I said no. Something just didn't feel right. Without that refusal, Julian's remains would have been destroyed, and the evidence they needed would have been gone with him. Forensic teams prepared for exhumation with strict protocols. Chain of custody was established on site. Soil temperature, body condition, and burial depth were logged. The remains were transported directly to a controlled lab under Home Office supervision. A full post-mortem was scheduled, one that had never been done in 1994. Forensic pathologist Dr. Elizabeth Hartley led the team. Initial findings showed no external trauma, no fractures, no visible bruising, but toxicology samples taken from the preserved tissues returned unexpected results. High concentrations of amitriptyline, a tricyclic antidepressant, were found in the liver and muscle samples. Combined with salicylates, consistent with aspirin, the dosages detected far exceeded therapeutic levels. According to Dr. Hartley's report, the presence of amitriptyline in this quantity suggests deliberate administration. Accidental overdose is highly unlikely given the concentration levels and the absence of any prescribed medications at time of death. Julian Webb had never been diagnosed with depression. No records indicated he had been prescribed amitriptyline. No pill bottles were logged in the initial scene notes. And without an autopsy in 1994, no one had ever looked for it. Now they had the confirmation they needed. At this point, detectives didn't need to speculate. They had a body. They had blood chemistry. They had financial documents showing motive. They had behavioral patterns repeated across 3 marriages. Still, protocol required that they isolate variables. They weren't ready to file charges, not yet. They interviewed Dina again, this time in connection with a reopened death inquiry. She denied everything, said Julian had been depressed, said she never saw him take pills, but she wouldn't be surprised if he did, said the insurance was his idea. She claimed to be the victim in Richard's attack. She said the police had it out for her. The lead investigator noted in his report, she answered every question with a question, shifted focus. Never once asked what we found? When a body is buried under the wrong assumptions, justice doesn't just stall, it decays. But sometimes when the ground is reopened, the truth comes up with it. In May of 2001, Julian Webb's body was exhumed from St. Mary's Cemetery on Hailing Island. He had been in the ground for nearly 7 years. No prior autopsy had been performed. No toxicology. His original cause of death had been listed as unascertained. The file had sat dormant until a surviving husband, Richard Thompson, came forward in a separate assault case, and Dina Thompson's name reappeared on a different kind of form. The exhumation was carried out under strict forensic protocol. This wasn't just a routine body retrieval. It was a controlled operation designed to recover biological evidence in a case where time had already done considerable damage. A forensic pathologist from the Home Office, Dr. Elizabeth Hartley, was assigned lead. She specialized in delayed toxicology, cases where decomposition challenged evidence retention. Julian's remains, though decomposed, were intact enough to preserve internal tissue samples. His liver, kidney, and hair follicles were prioritized for analysis. The coffin had been well sealed. Soil temperatures had remained stable over the years. That helped. But Dr. Hartley's notes made one thing clear. This would be a difficult case, not because of lack of evidence, but because it should have been examined years earlier. Initial physical review showed no trauma, no fractures, no signs of physical assault, but that had already been expected. The case hinged not on surface evidence, but what was preserved inside the body. Samples were sent to 2 independent labs, one in Cambridge and another in Birmingham. Both reported the same findings. Amitriptyline, a tricyclic antidepressant, was found in Julian's liver and muscle tissue at a concentration far exceeding what would be prescribed in clinical use. Not trace amounts, not incidental, a toxic dose. Blood presence was estimated post-mortem based on saturation levels in the remaining tissue. The consensus: fatal ingestion consistent with acute poisoning. Alongside it, salicylates, most commonly found in over-the-counter aspirin. What stood out was the ratio. According to Dr. Hartley's post-mortem statement, the quantities present in Julian's body were not consistent with accidental ingestion. No doctor had ever prescribed the medication. No GP records linked Julian to any treatment involving amitriptyline. His toxicology profile didn't reflect misuse, it reflected administration. In lay terms, he had to be given the drugs and he likely wasn't aware of it. That conclusion shifted the entire direction of the case. Investigators returned to the original field notes from 1994. Paramedics had observed no pill bottles at the scene, no open packaging, no suicide note. Dina Thompson had told medical staff her husband had been in a dark place and drank whiskey that night. But forensic reconstruction based on liver enzymes and tissue breakdown suggested something else. The drugs had been ingested hours before Julian's death. He would have been unconscious, likely incapable of voluntary action, before his heart stopped. There was no chance he had the coordination to stage a suicide or prepare a fatal dose. This was not self-administered. The estimated time of ingestion lined up almost exactly with the birthday dinner Dina had prepared. Toxicology provided the foundation, but forensic analysts didn't stop there. Lab investigators cross-referenced chemical markers with environmental absorption data, measuring how the compound interacted with stomach content, what passed into the bloodstream, and at what rate it degraded post-mortem. These calculations were slow, but they confirmed timing. Julian had ingested the poison less than 3 hours before his death, and it was absorbed efficiently, suggesting the drugs were delivered in food or drink, not swallowed in pill form. This narrowed the method of delivery, not a capsule, not a bottle, likely a meal-based administration. Investigators now had both a forensic cause of death and an approximate delivery window. But motive required more than science. It required context. That came from the financials, still under review and detailed further in the next phase. For now, the pathology spoke loud enough. One question hung in the air during the post-mortem review. Why hadn't this been discovered sooner? The answer wasn't complex. It was procedural. In 1994, the absence of visible wounds, paired with a spouse's plausible narrative and no pressure from the family to contest it, meant no deeper medical analysis was ordered. There had been no request for histology, no formal request for toxicology. What could have been prevented was written off as personal tragedy. And in towns like Hailing Island, tragedies don't always trigger suspicion until they repeat. From an evidentiary standpoint, this chapter marked the turning point. Julian Webb's death could no longer be labeled as unexplained. The classification changed. It was now a homicide by poisoning. At this point in the investigation, detectives didn't have to argue theory. The science had done the work. They had a victim, they had a timeline, they had chemical compounds that shouldn't have been there, and a documented history of behavioral control by the only person present that night. Still, charges weren't filed yet. The Crown Prosecution Service required a chain, not just a single link: motive, access, prior behavior. And the next phase focused on what else Dina had left behind that she thought no one would ever look at: handwriting, account applications, and insurance policies. Not all weapons leave bruises, some leave ink, and that ink, stamped across forged signatures, fake applications, and false declarations, would prove just as deadly. After toxicology reclassified Julian Webb's death as homicide, investigators turned to what had always been quietly suspicious but never properly examined: Dina Thompson's handling of finances during and after her husband's deaths. This wasn't about speculation. This was about records, unchangeable, date-stamped documents she never thought anyone would revisit. Starting with the basics, investigators requested Julian Webb's banking history during the months leading to his death. Barclays Bank provided a full statement history, including internal notes tied to customer interactions. That's where discrepancies emerged. According to the logs, Julian had visited the bank just 3 weeks prior to his death to update beneficiary instructions for a life insurance policy he reportedly never discussed with his family. But handwriting experts flagged the signature on the forms as inconsistent with his known writing. To confirm, authorities brought in forensic document examiner Richard Kellman, certified by the British Institute of Graphologists. He compared 3 known samples of Julian's signature, including his employment contracts and driver's license, to the signature on the insurance paperwork. The results were clear. The stroke pressure, letter formation, and slant pattern did not match. The insurance documents had been forged. The policy itself raised additional red flags. Opened only 4 months before Julian's death, it named Dina Thompson as the sole beneficiary on a £35,000 payout, approximately $50,000 USD at the time. The insurer confirmed that the application had been submitted via postal form, and while they had a scanned copy of the physical paperwork, the original had been destroyed in routine storage clearing. But the print logs showed something odd. The application listed Julian's prior address, not the one he was living in with Dina at the time. It also claimed he was in perfect health with no history of mental illness. Yet, Dina had told paramedics on the night of his death that he had been unstable and had attempted suicide once before. In other words, she played both narratives, sane enough to insure, troubled enough to explain a suspicious death. And then came the check records. Investigators retrieved canceled checks from Julian's business account. One had been made out to cash and endorsed in Dina Thompson's handwriting just 48 hours before Julian died. The amount, £4,000. The memo line simply read, loan. There were no matching withdrawals by Julian around that time. It appeared he didn't know the money was missing. All of this pointed to one pattern. Dina operated with premeditation, planning financial gains ahead of time and documenting them in ways that could pass quick scrutiny but collapse under forensic review. But Julian wasn't her only financial target. Investigators, now working with a multi-agency task force, reviewed her marriage to Lee Wyatt, her first husband. Public records revealed Dina had never legally divorced Lee, which meant her marriage to Julian was void from a legal standpoint. That discovery allowed police to examine Lee's financial background with renewed authority. They found similar behavior: accounts drained, insurance policies modified, unexplained withdrawals. But Lee Wyatt was still alive, albeit under a new identity after years of harassment. When he was located and interviewed, he provided critical testimony. Dina had once pressured him into signing life insurance paperwork just in case something happened. He had refused. Weeks later, he found out she submitted the form anyway, using a forged signature. Those testimonies, paired with forensic handwriting evidence, built a clear pattern of conduct: fraudulent documentation to secure financial advantage, always in proximity to sudden medical emergencies or unexplained deaths. Dina's third known marriage to Richard Thompson, the man she tied up and attempted to kill with a knife in 2001, followed a similar financial trajectory. She had recently convinced him to sign a will making her sole beneficiary. He hadn't even read it. That will was recovered and reviewed. Another handwriting inconsistency, another forgery. By this point, the evidence wasn't circumstantial. It was compiled, forensic, and demonstrable across separate jurisdictions. Each forged document became a nail in the legal coffin. To tie it all together, prosecutors assembled a full timeline of Dina Thompson's paper trail: 1993-1994, forges life insurance forms in Julian Webb's name. 1994, Julian dies under suspicious conditions, ruled unexplained at the time. 1995 to 2000, lives under multiple identities, opens credit cards and insurance accounts in others' names. 2000, marries Richard Thompson while still married to Lee Wyatt. 2000-2001, attempts to alter Richard Thompson's will. 2001, attacks Richard during staged sex therapy session, arrested. This document timeline served as prosecutorial evidence of intent, planning, and execution, terms critical to proving murder beyond reasonable doubt under UK law. But more importantly, it established a method. Dina didn't just act on impulse. She designed a repeatable system: isolate the victim, gain control of their finances, eliminate the threat, collect. In a later interview, one investigator summarized it this way: she weaponized paperwork. Every signature she forged was a calculated act of violence. And behind each forged signature was a person who thought they were safe until they weren't. What Julian Webb's body couldn't say in 1994, his financial records screamed in 2001. That's what finally made prosecutors move. It was the quiet hours between December and January, the kind that settle over a town when the holidays end, but justice hasn't yet come. Lawrence County was still holding its breath. But inside the sheriff's office, investigators were pushing forward with what they had: gaps in alibis, digital trails, inconsistencies in demeanor. Andrew Searle had been walking a tight line between concerned husband and man with something to hide. What changed everything was the data they couldn't unearth by asking, but had to extract through signal, code, and pattern. By mid-January 2025, a court order yielded access to Andrew's full mobile GPS history and cell tower pings. His phone, like most people's, had been quietly reporting his location even when he wasn't aware of it. Paired with subpoenaed data from his vehicle's onboard system, the detectives began stitching together a clearer timeline for the night Alexandra was last seen alive, December 17, 2024. At 11:43 p.m. that night, Andrew's Dodge Ram left the Searle residence and traveled south for approximately 38 minutes. The final destination wasn't a restaurant, it wasn't a hospital, it wasn't even on a paved road. The coordinates, cross-verified from both his truck's GPS logs and cell tower triangulation, placed him at a remote, wooded patch near Neely Ferry Road. The area was familiar only to locals who hunted or grew up in Lawrence County. Andrew did not fit either category. What stood out wasn't just the location, it was the duration. His truck remained stationary at that location for precisely 27 minutes. He made no phone calls, sent no texts, and his phone registered zero biometric activity. No unlocks, no app usage. The signal went dead, as if intentionally ignored. When investigators overlaid this movement with Alexandra's last known phone ping, the results were too aligned to ignore. Her signal had terminated less than 500 yards from the coordinates where Andrew had stopped that night. Her phone had never moved again. A decision was made. On January 16th, a forensic search team, aided by 2 cadaver dogs from Spartanburg County and a drone unit, was deployed to the site. The terrain was rough, mostly overgrown, damp, and scattered with fallen pine. There were no marked trails, but the drone images, analyzed in thermal overlay, showed irregular heat patterns from the ground, a potential sign of disturbed soil that hadn't settled back properly. At approximately 1:42 p.m., one of the cadaver dogs gave a trained alert at the edge of a creek basin. Minutes later, the second dog confirmed. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed to avoid premature digging. The anomaly was shallow. Under a thin layer of pine needles and loosely packed dirt, the forensic team uncovered what appeared to be a wrapped human form. Duct tape, layers of black plastic sheeting, and industrial zip ties. What they would later confirm, through dental records and a tattoo on the ankle, was the body of Alexandra Searle. Her remains were intact but severely decomposed, likely due to moisture and cold conditions. The sheet wrapped around her body showed signs of adhesive bonding, as if hastily sealed with construction-grade tape. A kitchen knife, wiped clean but partially rusted, was found buried nearby in the same grave. Forensics could not recover blood from the blade, but the tape bore traces of skin cells and long strands of dark blonde hair consistent with Alexandra's profile. Andrew was not immediately arrested. Instead, investigators began working methodically. Every digital movement he made following that night, every app opened, every account accessed, every odd internet search was re-examined. They found a concerning browser history on one of his backup phones. Searches for, "Can you track a body by phone signal?" "Best way to bury in wet ground," and "How long does it take to find a body in woods?" All time-stamped within 72 hours after Alexandra vanished. Meanwhile, the autopsy report confirmed what detectives feared. Alexandra had sustained blunt force trauma to the head, likely inflicted with a flat-surfaced object. There was no indication of defensive wounds, suggesting she may have been incapacitated quickly. Traces of diphenhydramine, an over-the-counter sedative, were present in her system at levels exceeding standard usage. The coroner concluded that she had likely been drugged prior to death. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was premeditated. The careful wrapping, the isolated location, the lack of any accidental evidence. Each move was calculated, and still, the smallest signals, ignored by the killer, were what brought her back. The lead detective would later say, he buried her with the same silence he'd maintained for years in that marriage. But the earth doesn't forget, and neither does digital trace. At the Searle residence, police returned with a second search warrant. This time, they took specific interest in a locked shed behind the garage. Inside, they found matching rolls of the same black plastic sheeting, an opened pack of industrial zip ties, and 2 pairs of heavy-duty gloves. 1 pair tested positive for trace elements of Alexandra's hair. By the following morning, Andrew Searle was brought in for formal questioning, not as a witness, but as a suspect. By the time Dina Thompson stood trial at the Old Bailey in 2003, the illusion was gone. No more charm, no more carefully staged vulnerability. The courtroom didn't see a grieving widow. It saw a woman who had outlived one husband, manipulated another, and now stood accused of cold-blooded murder. Julian Webb was 47 when he died. His death was initially ruled sudden and unexplained. A man with a history of mental health concerns found lifeless at home. But the toxicology report told a different story. Lethal levels of the antidepressant amitriptyline were found in his system. The dosage was far beyond any therapeutic range. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't self-administered. The prosecution laid out a chilling timeline. Julian had recently reconciled with Dana after a brief separation. On the night of his death, New Year's Day 2000, they shared dinner at her place. The next morning, he was found dead on the couch. Dina claimed he had taken too much medication, perhaps even tried to overdose, but there was no prescription to match the amount found in his system, and no fingerprints on the packaging, except hers. Forensic evidence anchored the case. The water glass from which Julian supposedly swallowed the pills had her prints, not his. A handwritten list found in her home, titled "Men Who Have Hurt Me," included Julian's name. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just silence, a body, and a woman who already had a history of deception. Investigators revealed that Dina had previously tried to poison her second husband, Richard Thompson, by spiking his drink with a sedative cocktail. He survived. but she was never formally charged until now. That past attempt, once circumstantial, now looked like a dry run. The defense portrayed Julian as unstable and depressed, but witnesses disagreed. He had started rebuilding his life. Friends described him as hopeful. He was planning a holiday. He had returned to work, and most notably, he had expressed fears about Dina. A journal found in his flat contained one entry: "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." It wasn't just about one death anymore. The court saw a pattern: multiple men, multiple deceptions, financial fraud, emotional manipulation, and now, forensic evidence of intentional poisoning. It was enough. The jury found Dina Thompson guilty of murder. The judge, in sentencing her to life imprisonment, called her a manipulative and dangerous woman with a pattern of predatory behavior toward men. She showed no visible reaction when the sentence was read, but even with a conviction, justice felt incomplete. Julian's family had spent years living with uncertainty. The truth came late, and it came cruel. He died not in a fit of rage, not in some heated domestic moment, but quietly, in his sleep, because someone planned it that way. Dina's story would later be used in training materials for British homicide detectives, an example of long-term manipulation, delayed detection, and the importance of revisiting so-called natural deaths. But for the families of the victims, there was no academic interest, only grief. After Dina Thompson's conviction in 2003, the immediate headlines wrote themselves: "The Black Widow jailed for life. Husband killer exposed after years of deceit." But beyond the bold type, what followed was a quiet reckoning inside the UK criminal justice system. Thompson wasn't just another manipulative spouse. Her case presented a rare confluence: multiple marriages, financial fraud, psychiatric manipulation, and finally homicide, carried out with clinical precision. That combination forced investigators and prosecutors to rethink how such patterns were identified and handled. Julian Webb's case, once considered a closed chapter of natural death, was now treated as a procedural failure. The toxicology data had been available in 2000, yet it wasn't acted upon until new complaints against Thompson triggered a review years later. Internal police reports admitted that no forensic red flag was followed through. That lapse became a teaching point. In response, the Metropolitan Police introduced a pilot initiative in 2004. It targeted suspicious partner deaths, especially those initially ruled as natural or overdose-related. Investigators revisited over 100 archived cases, prioritizing those involving prior domestic violence or unexplained financial withdrawals post-mortem. The Webb Directive, though unofficial in name, became a fixture in homicide training manuals. Press coverage intensified after a BBC documentary aired interviews with Julian's family. His sister spoke plainly. "He told us he wasn't safe with her. But what do you do when the police say there's nothing suspicious?" That statement circulated widely. It struck a chord, not just about Dina's manipulation, but about institutional delay. Within criminology circles, the case became a framework to study female-perpetrated intimate partner homicide, a category that had historically received less attention. Dina Thompson's methods, non-confrontational, pharmaceutical, concealed, highlighted a blind spot in traditional investigative models that focused on visible trauma or overt violence. More broadly, media scrutiny uncovered another layer. Thompson's financial scams ran parallel to her domestic crimes. She had used forged signatures, fake identities, and marriage certificates to secure loans, insurance payouts, and benefits. These acts, while not always physically violent, had lasting effects on victims who survived her. For the families, public awareness was a double-edged sword. On one hand, exposure led to policy shifts and greater vigilance. On the other, the constant retelling reopened wounds. Julian's family in particular declined most further interviews after 2005. Their legal representative issued a short statement. They seek closure, not notoriety. Even in prison, Dina Thompson remained a subject of concern. In 2006, she was placed on a restricted inmate list after staff flagged attempts to establish contact with men outside. Authorities cited patterns of manipulation consistent with prior convictions. She remained under observation, though no new incidents were confirmed. As one retired investigator later reflected, "We underestimated her, not just her intent, but her method. She used charm like a weapon. But this wasn't passion, it was calculated." In 2003, Dina Thompson was convicted of murdering her third husband, Julian Webb, with a life sentence and no chance of parole. It had taken 6 years to get there. Julian died in 1997, and for a long time, no one asked the right questions. The cause of death was unclear. There were no obvious wounds, no violent struggle, just a man collapsed after a meal and a wife who claimed it was sudden. But behind that silence, a pattern was hiding. Dina had a long history of deception, multiple husbands, secret bank accounts, false identities. She wasn't just unlucky in love, she was orchestrating it. One husband had died under strange circumstances. Another claimed she'd defrauded him. The records showed money moved, wills altered, and claims filed. When police reopened Julian's case, they found sedatives in his system, drugs he never should have had. Digital evidence confirmed what many suspected. Dina had searched how to administer drugs and how to file for life insurance. The documents were there. The timeline matched. Financial records didn't lie. She had counted on the system not asking too much, and for a while she was right. But justice eventually came, not loud, but certain. Her case triggered internal reviews. Medical examiners reevaluated how natural deaths were ruled. Agencies cross-checked spousal deaths and benefit claims more closely. Julian Webb's case wasn't just about one man's murder, it was about a system learning to see through polite lies. Today, Dina Thompson remains behind bars. She showed no remorse, but her conviction gave Julian's family answers and gave investigators a lesson. Not all murderers use force, some use trust, and sometimes the truth is slow, but unstoppable. Looking back, I believe the silence around Julian's death wasn't just an accident. It was a warning about what happens when red flags are ignored. As someone who has walked through every page of this case, my takeaway is simple. Trust is powerful, but when placed in the wrong hands, it can destroy lives. Let this story be a reminder to listen to instincts, to ask hard questions, and to never dismiss patterns of manipulation, no matter how quiet they seem. What would you have done if someone close to you showed those signs? Have you ever seen charm used to control rather than care? I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether this video touched you, surprised you, or even if you disagreed. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if this story made you reflect, even just a little, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next case. More real stories are coming, and together, we'll keep uncovering what hides in plain sight.